Good morning, all of you, and I must really thank the Christ University for having me here on this issue. And I'm amazed how Professor Uma Devi could have actually invited me to a law school with so many of you aspiring lawyers when I'm not a lawyer. I never studied law. I'm interested in law for two completely different reasons, because I did engineering. All my education has been in engineering, but law to me seems to be one of the subjects or topics where reason and logic is almost mathematical. And that kind of interested me in trying to understand some aspects of law, because I can't think of another subject in social science which is so dependent on logic, which is very mathematical in one sense. So what I hope, although I'm standing on this side and I'm not used to speaking to particularly students, such large number of students like you here, but what I hope to do is not so much what I might be able to tell you. What I hope by the end of this day, you should be able to teach me something more about law that I don't know. Because you are the ones who are actually specializing in law. Because otherwise my trip to Bangalore would not really be so satisfying. Because after all, if I don't take back anything from the Christ University, it will be my loss. So I'd like you to not accept anything I say just because I'm saying it. I'd like you to actually see if you can question and be critical of anything that I might say, because it's only through that kind of questioning would you and I be able to gain something out of this. Because obviously if you are spending so much of your time and mine in spending a day together, then we should maximize our benefits. On this issue of property, like Professor Samu already mentioned, there's been a continuous debate. And I wonder how many of you realize why we tried to link it with democracy. Because I'm told that all of you are studying property law in some form, right? But I don't know to what extent you have studied our constitution yet, the Indian constitution, or the world history or his political history in terms of understanding the rise of democracy. And if you find any relationship between property and democracy. Because that was one of my interests in trying to understand why this issue is so relevant and so critical. Yeah?
So the freedom of the individual, as long as the individual has the liberty to own his own property, he becomes a constituent unit of the society, free of having the ability to voice his opinion. That's why voting rights in 1935 in most countries were restricted solely to landowners and property owners. Because the moment you held
And to men.
Because the moment you held property, you were considered an individual sovereign within the sovereignty.
Great. I'm glad. See, this is what I want to learn from you guys. I'm really impressed. And this didn't actually happen in 1935. And I don't know if you heard what he said, that property is the first form of ownership, and by owning property you actually become a legitimate sovereign and therefore a citizen. And citizenship actually was defined by property ownership for a couple of thousand years. It's not 1935 alone that this issue of elections and voting started. What's the history of democracy? When did we first have democratic governments anywhere in the world? Anyone? Greece. Yeah, that's 2000 years old. And in Greece, the criteria of being a citizen was ownership of property, including slaves. And this is really, really interesting if you really look at Greece. Because in the first city-state of Athens, there was a king, as in those days until very recently. Kings and queens and emperors were the norm. In Greece, were the city-states, or many city-states in Greece, but in Athens, the traders who were increasingly becoming very wealthy because they were the heart or the center of the world in the ancient world. And with trading, they were really becoming very wealthy. And they began to ask that why do they needed a king to rule? Because king can rule for two reasons. One, he is powerful and his power emanates from his capacity to mobilize the forces, the police and the military. And second, he is powerful because he has the economic resource to sustain the military and the police. And therefore he could rule by force and he could afford to use the force. These traders in Greece, they began questioning that why do we need an external ruler? After all, together they were equally rich, if not richer than the king. And they knew more about economics than the king would ever do. And if they could come together, they could form their own government. And that is how, more than 2,000 years ago, the ownership of property enabled the first people in the world to actually think of questioning what had been the norm, that the kings and queens and emperors are the natural rulers. And to me this was really interesting because this happened 2,000 years ago, and since then there have been various episodes of this kind, some successful, others not so successful. Let me try one more question. You know, we all know most dramatic reforms started or happened in England almost 1,000 years ago, slightly less. Anyone? Huh? 1215. And what was 1215? Magna Carta. How many of you had heard of Magna Carta? Lots. I'm so glad. What happened in Magna Carta? What happened in Magna Carta? You know, Magna Carta was a document where the king signed with some of the other lords in England. But what did he sign? Actually, if you really look at the history of that, of 1215, it was actually a battlefield. The king and his supporters were on one side, and the feudal lords and their supporters were on the other, and they were ready to go to battle. But both sides found that they were pretty evenly matched. And if they really fought, it would have been a slaughter, with no assurance for victory for any side. You know, which means that the two sides were quite evenly balanced on the battlefield. And how did that happen? Just like in ancient Greece. In 1215, the feudal lords in England were quite angry with the king, because the king was using or exercising power very arbitrarily. You know, the king could arrest people, could send people to exile, could take their property. And people were upset that these were being done not in a manner that would seem legitimate to them and to the wider population. They thought it was happening in a very arbitrary and whimsical manner without any rational justification. So they questioned the king. The king, of course, being the king, could not relent so easily, and therefore the two sides gathered on the battlefield. Because just like the traders of ancient Greece, by 1215 in England, there were a lot of chieftains or lords who acquired enough property, particularly land, and therefore were able to command a lot of resources on their own, and collectively found that just like the traders of ancient Greece, they could withstand the pressure of the king. And that's how Magna Carta, if you read Magna Carta, it's such an amazing document that emerged, and in fact one of the first staple of modern human rights, that it came about in that dramatic fashion because people were tired of the king's arbitrary exercise of power. From 1215, it's not been, make no mistake, ancient Greece was not what you would call an ideal democracy in today's terms. Not only they had slavery, there were many other categories who couldn't vote or who were not citizens of Greece. And England, although it began parliament, it was a very limited parliament. It were only the lords, and again, because they acquired so much of wealth and land, that they became real intermediaries or full citizens to be able to sit in parliament. So these are not ideal conditions by today's standards. But what we should realize is that these things happened 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. The world was a very different place. The ideal that we aspire today, we could not even have conceived it had people before us not fought and gained it inch by inch. And that's why history to me is so relevant, because to me it becomes living. But because what we are today is because of what they did 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Because that's our debt to them, to our past. And we must recognize that. Because if we do not learn that lesson of history, we will be repeating the same mistakes that we tend to do again and again. And we'll come to that, and this state is a very good example in recent times of similar mistakes that rulers and political leadership can continue to make. And this has been it didn't stop there. The next one, of course, was the American Revolution in 1776. Then you had the French Revolution later that century, 18th century. And of course, all the rest, the modern democracies in the 19th and the 20th century, and of course India, the largest of all democracies today. But there's a very distinctiveness about Indian democracy, the way it is, the way it emerged in 1947-50. And so what's that? Because he mentioned 1935, but Indian democracy had a very distinct, or emerged from the start in a way that hardly any democracies did before that. Can you think of one characteristic that makes us so unique, and that makes me feel so proud of being an Indian? Yeah? Universal suffrage, universal adult franchise. We are the only major country that didn't go through a restricted form of democracy that most other older democracies had gone through. Restricted means, like I said, the slaves were not entitled to vote, of course. Even women were not entitled to vote till, say, in England in 1920s. So, in that sense, India was unique because we didn't qualify our citizenship. Anyone who was here and subsequently born here could be a citizen and be an equal citizen. We didn't demand any qualifications such as gender or property or education to become a citizen, and a full citizen at that. If you read the Constituent Assembly debates, I know how many of you have ever read the Constituent Assembly debates. At least there are few. Okay, great, there are few. And the Constituency Assembly debates of 1947-49 is actually there, full, all of it, on the website of Parliament, so you can read it anytime. If you read that, you'll find a very interesting, at least I found a very interesting section or segment, which was about this question of universal adult franchise, that every adult could vote without any qualification. And this was really unique at that time because, like I said, there was hardly any democracy which adopted that from its start. And there was a big debate in India in the Constituent Assembly, not so much about property or as wealth as a criteria of citizenship, but about education, about literacy. No, there was a huge debate that can a country as poor as ours in 1947 or 50, can a country where there was so, if today we are 65-70% literate, in those days we were just 20% literate. That can a country with 80% illiterate population be really entrusted the freedom to vote? That was a big debate, a very big debate. If you read the Constituent Assembly debates, you will realize how hotly people discussed and debated this issue. That is it really possible? But of course, what prevailed was, Nehru and many others did prevail upon others that we should have universal adult franchise because we should count on people as citizens not because they have any particular characteristics such as education or wealth, but they possess the basic human characteristics that they are human and they possess the basic wisdom of life. That they may be poor, they may be illiterate, but they possess the basic wisdom of life which makes them as equal as anybody else, and therefore the right to vote as political citizens of our republic. And this to me was extremely good, not just in terms of its principle, that we accepted equality from the start. This to me is actually proven 60 years later. 60 years later, we are perhaps one of the 2 or 3 democracies in the world which became independent after the Second World War in the 1940s and 50s, who have retained our constitutional structure and electoral form of democracy right through. Even emergency in the 1970s was imposed by an elected government and was defeated through the electoral process. So we are, and that's the second thing that makes me so proud, that we have retained a constitutional democracy for all these years. And, at least, I don't know if you think why it happened, why we had this, why we succeeded when so many others found it so difficult to retain a constitution. In our neighborhood, hardly anyone could do that. Sri Lanka, I think, had modified its constitution or even overthrown its own constitution 7 times in the last 60 years. And Pakistan and Bangladesh, it has gone through so many military coups in order to get rid of their constitution. Why did it happen? Because this to me is very interesting and very relevant. It shows not that the principles that we are talking of are not just abstract principles. The principles of human rights or property rights are not abstract principles. They have practical relevance here and now. And one reason I believe we retained our constitutional electoral democracy for all these years is because a large section of people voted. And those who vote, again, a unique feature of Indian democracy. It's the poorest who vote in largest numbers. It's not, I don't know how many of you in this room have the right to vote yet, but some of you I'm sure would have the right to vote. But most people in this room, I'll be very happy and I'll be pleasantly surprised that when you do get your right to vote will actually exercise it. Because in most cities and in most middle class and upper middle class houses, people turning out to vote are much smaller than people at the lower end of the economic ladder. And it is because they voted, and they voted regularly, they voted repeatedly, and increasingly they saw the impact of their vote in terms of changing governments, that the system's legitimacy was accepted. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult for an abstract principle to be accepted in a country which is so diverse, which is challenged in so many forms, from education and literacy and all the rest. But in all this, while I'm very proud of both these achievements of India, and a universal adult franchise and sustenance of constitutional democracy, there is another element in our constitution, and which is where we come to the debate on property, which did not acquire as much, or we didn't appreciate its significance as much as we ought to have in 1950 and perhaps today. Like I said before, democracies across the world started with ownership of property. India is perhaps one of the only constitutions in the world where in 1950 right to property was in Article 19 of the Fundamental Rights. How many of you have read the Constitution? Oh, not all. I thought all of you would raise your hands to say that you have read the Constitution, at least parts of it. Yeah? But at least you can read it. It's not easy to read, no doubt. You'll go to sleep while reading it. Now it's 300 pages. But you could at least read bits and pieces in parts. And it's interesting to read Article 19, the Fundamental Rights. There has been a major change in Article 19 in the last few years or a few decades. Can you tell me what? Right to property? What about that? Huh? The right to education. Yeah, but it started from the whole attempt is to make it a justiciable of a right in the form of a fundamental right. The right to property is interesting is because Article 19(1)(f), we were really one of the very few constitutions where right to property was enshrined as a fundamental right in the constitution at its start. And again you can read the Constituent Assembly debates about how vigorously this issue was debated in 1947-49. It was felt at that time that property is only relevant for the rich and the powerful. And in a country which was so poor, property is not really so relevant. And therefore, Article 19(1)(f) got deleted in which year? Which year? Loud, I can't hear. Which year? Article 19(1)(f), which year was it deleted?
1976.
Wrong. Which amendment of the Constitution was it? 44th. Which 44th amendment is a very important amendment in our Constitution. Which year was it enacted? 78. It was 1978 where Article 19(1)(f) was deleted. It was deleted by the first non-Congress government in Delhi, the Janata Party, which came to power in 77. They were trying to undo the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, which was introduced during the days of the emergency and had a lot of harsh or detrimental or negative impact on our constitution and democracy itself. So in their attempt to rectify the errors of 42nd Amendment, 42nd Amendment was passed in 76 and 44th Amendment got passed in Parliament in 78, and while rectifying the ills of 42nd, we also deleted 19(1)(f). But that was actually, you could say, a culmination. The problem or the challenge of 19(1)(f) or right to property started from the very first amendment to the Indian Constitution. What was the first amendment to the Constitution? The first amendment? First amendment to the Constitution. It was in 1951, within a year of enactment of the Constitution. I'm sure some of you know about it. It was the 9th schedule. The 9th schedule was brought in as a reflection of the debate in Constituent Assembly. That property, particularly land, needed to be redistributed. And states were fighting to abolish the zamindari, or the large land holdings. And the courts were inclined to look at it as a violation of right to property. And therefore, 9th schedule was created in 1951 as a way to put some of the laws enacted by the states and the center within the purview of the 9th schedule and therefore protect it from judicial overturn, potentially. But there was a very interesting judgment that happened in 2007 or 8 on 9th schedule. You know? What happened in that? Yeah, correct. The 9th schedule got opened after how much? More than 50 years. For 50 years, the court respected the 9th schedule. And it got challenged or overturned only in 2007 or 8. I don't remember the exact date now. 7. Yeah, 2007. And this is really interesting these days. That's why I'm mentioning it. Because if you really look at the Constituent Assembly debate of 47-49, and if you look at the number of constitutional amendments right from the First Amendment to the 44th Amendment, how gradually right to property was being questioned and curtailed. For instance, the very word compensation had to be removed from the compensation regarding property. Because compensation was being interpreted by the courts as market-based compensation. And the governments were not willing or keen to offer market-based compensation for property taken. And therefore the word compensation got replaced by any amount. And then there was an attempt to put the amount itself beyond judicial scrutiny. So there had been a continuous attempt, in fact at least 20 of the amendments to the Constitution had something or the other to do with restricting or curtailing right to property. And it got deleted in 1978. But this is where the other part of politics or history, recent Indian history, is so relevant. You know, today most of you would probably know or probably recognize that there's something that's happening across the country which is quite common, doesn't matter Karnataka, Bengal or anywhere else, UP. Now, can you identify a factor that is very common to a large number of states and has been becoming increasingly vocal, people protesting all over? Land. Right? And it's happening over the last 5-7 years, it's become very visible, protests and violence and all the rest. But it didn't really start 5-7 years ago. One of the major land-related protests started very soon after 1978 when property right was deleted from the Constitution. Can you think of it? It was perhaps India's first major mass movement on land. And it happened in the 1980s. It started in the 1980s. It continued for 10, 12, 15 years. Which one? Which one? Louder! You may be right, so don't feel shy. Yeah, Bhutan was before. Bhutan was big, but it was not as big in terms of mobilizing as many people as it did, perhaps. Bhutan was, we know of Hawaiian before. The Narmada Dam. Narmada Dam mobilized millions. And they were all protesting displacement and demanding rehabilitation. And it's not a coincidence that it happened, it started soon after the ending of fundamental right, or right to property as a fundamental right in 1978. Throughout the 1980s, large chunks of Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, and of course activists across the country, were agitating against that dam. But there are two elements to it. One which we will not discuss today, which is the issue of the dam itself, whether the dam needs to be built or land. But the issue that we should discuss today is the issue of land. Because since that movement, and I was a student in 1970s, and I saw this movement very closely because some of my friends were very directly involved throughout the 80s. What we saw was this movement, which started in 1980, today has gone much deeper. And you can make this out from the fact that, the dam was a very visible symbol. It was displacing a few lakh people. The dam was going to submerge thousands of acres of land. But today, it's not such large projects that are being debated. The contention is regarding even the small packets of land. And obviously last year we saw the potential political impact of such disclosure. Yeah. Such agitation and protest. And you can see that in West Bengal, in Singur, compared to the thousands of acres that was getting acquired for the dam in the 80s, even 1,000 acres in Singur in West Bengal led to such a large protest that it brought down a government that was in power for 30 years. And this is what, to me, is most significant, and for all of us to understand. That it is very good and it's fine to understand the principles, to understand the constitution and the law, but if we do not understand the political process that makes those laws, we would be not understanding the whole story. Because look at it this way, to me this is the most amazing part. That here was the intellectual arguments made against right to property right from the Constituent Assembly to the point where it was deleted. There was continuous effort to take over land, but with periodic elections and voting, democracy in India was deepening. And when people began to see that their votes matter, that they can change government when they vote, they began to ask that by changing government, they can send a message to the governors, to the government, to recognize and respect their property. This is, to me, a circle going, the wheel turning a whole circle. Because like I said, 2000 years ago in Greece, it was accumulation of property and wealth that led to the birth of democracy. But in India today, it's deepening of democracy that is leading citizens to demand recognition and respect for their property. The ground in India is shifting. it does not matter what the Constitution might say in the letter of the Constitution. It does not matter what the courts might uphold as a matter of law. If the law is not seen as legitimate by the people, that law will not stand. Because in Magna Carta, or before Magna Carta, the king could claim whatever he was doing was by the law of the day. The French kings, even in the 17th, 18th century, could claim the divine right of the king. That the king represented the god and therefore whatever the king did would be legitimate. That is no longer the case. Legitimacy comes from the acceptance of the law and the process of that legislation by the people. And that has got questioned now in the last 7 years, 10 years. And this is really important for you and all of us who are interested in law to understand. It is not what is in the books. It is not what the courts might rule. But it is also important that the law must be seen as legitimate. That the process by which a law is enacted must be seen as legitimate. If it is not, it will get questioned at a very fundamental level. And therefore you see this paradox today. All of our debate, we have this huge debate over India needs to develop and therefore we need land. All of these debates are pertaining to who is going to have access to land. And let me conclude by pointing out this Karnataka, because Karnataka has become a symbol of one such protest because of your mining problems. Why is it a problem? Why would mining or environment, the second half of our workshop today, environmental protection, be a problem? I would say it's a problem only because we are unable to apply the principles of law in a manner that would seem legitimate. For instance, and this is another of the paradoxes that we have to confront in India. We have inherited a British form of the constitutional government where the property, or the land particularly, is not owned so much, although we all think we own the land, but the ownership, we actually have the right to use that land. But actual ownership, like the British monarch, belongs to the monarch. Which is why the eminent domain, how many of you have heard of eminent domain? Yeah, that is quite a few of you. The eminent domain is an instrument that is used by the government or the monarch to take over land because it's their domain. But it need not be so. And let's look at mining. I'm told that in your mining district of Bellary, it is not just the big guys who are trying to extract illegal iron ore. A lot of small farmers are trying to do the same. And what's the problem? The problem is the law does not recognize mineral rights as property rights of the landowners. Under the British system of law, anything under the ground belongs to the state. But Britain, or the British system, is not the only system. There are other jurisdictions within the British system which have emerged from the British system. United States, for instance, or Australia, or Canada, where mineral rights are increasingly being devolved to the landowner, either individually or collectively, so that they can decide whether their property would be exploited or not. And therefore you wouldn't have a major debate. If anyone wants to mine or extract oil or whatever, they can strike a deal with the landlord, and if the landlord agrees, small or big doesn't matter. If the farmer agrees, then the mineral can be extracted. If he doesn't, then it won't. And let me give you two examples, because this ought to be discussed in much greater detail, because this is already happening in parts of the world in exactly the same manner. In Canada and Australia, the indigenous tribes have been recognized as owners of their land, and mineral companies, mining companies, have to negotiate a deal with those groups. so as to whether you can extract the minerals, what would be the royalty, or whether you can't. And therefore the whole debate goes down to a domain where it can actually be negotiated. Because the problem of a conflict is, and this is the whole definition of a conflict, that a conflict occurs when negotiations fail. And the legal framework that we are currently inherited is not facilitating negotiations. Question is, can we be creative? Because law is not written in stone. Can we be creative and think of ways of applying the principles of property in a manner, or learn from lessons that other countries have gone through in recent past, in the last 10-15 years, in very similar fashion, and avoid a potential political nightmare that we will confront? Because a large chunk of India may be poor, but a huge chunk of Indians, even though they are poor, are beginning to exercise their right as citizens. No amount of steamrolling over them would be possible. This country in the last 60 years has displaced more than 40 million people over various projects of land acquisition. Today, attempting to displace even 1,000 can be politically disastrous. Indians at the ground are changing. Can we, who try to understand the legal framework, understand the political framework, understand that the ground is changing and how we might adapt to the changing situation and figure out a way to resolve these conflicts? Because otherwise it will overwhelm us. One of the reasons why Maoist insurgency is so prevalent in parts of tribal India is precisely because tribal parts of India have no land rights. It's only in 2006 that the Forest Rights Act came as a way to beginning to recognize some form of land rights to the tribal population. And there are 100 million tribals. If such large sections of population are dissatisfied with the system, do not recognize the legitimacy of the system, we will have a crisis in our hands. And I hope by the end of the discussion today, we would be able to improve our understanding on something that is so live. We are no longer talking of a history 2,000 years ago. We are talking of India of today and the next 10 years. And what we understand today, how we shape our own future, will determine how this country and our constitutional democracy will thrive or not. Thank you very much, and I will welcome any questions.
I have just one question. You spoke of the difference between de jure and de facto law and how the political process basically decides what really is on the ground. How does law then cope with the fact that there's no legitimacy for the written law on the ground?
Really interesting, and that's a real challenge for all of you who want to be lawyers and might go on to become judges later on. Because part of the role is, the judiciary plays part of that role. They interpret the law according to the changing circumstance and therefore try to figure out when the law may not actually in letter outline what should be the situation. At times that can go to the other extent, and it could be like judicial activism, which might come with its own set of challenges. But the political feedback is equally relevant, which most of us generally do not recognize, and which is what needs to be recognized. Because the political process has to be legitimate, which it is. Because when you have a country where out of 700 million voters, 400 million turn out to vote, that's a very large number to ensure legitimacy. The question is, through that political process, how do you create or enact legislation in order to take care of the challenges that would come, or to meet this gap between what was the law or the statute and what the country wants or needs today? No, that's a big challenge. And it can happen, and it will happen through both routes. For instance, for instance, in Karnataka, the mining issue is the judiciary and the Lokayukta who took it up much more vigorously. But, and the example that I gave, that's not the only way. The mining royalties need not go only to the states. There are many jurisdictions in the world today where this has changed, coming from the same English legal system, jurisprudence. The eminent domain is getting curtailed across the world. And even if the law, and which is very interesting, just think, in the case of the Tatas in Singur, even the Supreme Court held that the land acquisition was legal. Correct? Even the Supreme Court held that the land acquisition in West Bengal for the Tata project was legal. But it ran into the problem in the ground. And therefore the political capacity to enforce the law would become very limited. And that to me is a very big question, challenge, because if the political legitimacy is gets limited, the legitimacy of the system will collapse. Which is why it is very dangerous to try to pass laws that cannot be enforced because people will not accept it. And I'm sure we can discuss during the day, there are n number of instances, particularly pertaining to economic laws, that we have passed in the last 50 years, but which has been impossible to enforce. Can I name one such one? Perhaps to me the biggest one, but some of you perhaps were not born when this was such a big issue. But the Bollywood movies made the most of it. Can you think of one law which was in India which could not be enforced in a very big way, or enforced at all? Precisely to underline this challenge. Can you think of one? No, land reforms land reforms could not be enforced because there was no takers anyway. But here, this was a law which was passed but could not be enforced because the whole law enforcement machinery failed to enforce it. And it was particularly an economic law. And Bollywood made big business out of that. How many of you have seen, say, movies such as Dawn? Or Amar Akbar Anthony? Or any such thing? Do you remember the biscuits that Amitabh Bachchan used to be smuggling? Why was it happening? Why was it happening? I remember it because it happened right through the 60s and 70s and 80s. I don't know how many of you would remember because that law no longer exists. And you can see the change. Bollywood no longer makes films about smuggling of biscuits. It was the Gold Control Order. Gold Control Order of 1964. And it was only in 1993 that that law was scrapped. And you see the consequence. The enormity of passing legislation that cannot be enforced. We became the largest country in history ever to smuggle gold in hundreds of tons every year. That process of smuggling corrupted law enforcement agencies and customs right from the top to bottom, because everyone was taking bribes. Because Indians, as we all know, Indians have a fascination for gold. We are one of the largest consumers of gold. And when the government says we shouldn't consume gold because foreign exchange has to be conserved, most people simply ignored that. And therefore the smugglers boomed, gold came in by the tons, the whole system was corrupted, and we paid a very heavy price in 1992. Can you think of that? Can you think of what happened in 1992? Again, some of you may not have been born, but no, the foreign exchange crisis was one, but I'm not talking about that. I mean, not that. 1992, something very specific, dramatic, and it shook. Huh? You have to be loud here because I have a hearing problem. 1991 was critical. We know the Babri Masjid demolition. 1992 was critical because Bombay exploded. There was serial bombing across Bombay. How did this serial bombing take place? And this is the price that we paid for passing legislations that cannot be enforced. How did that bombing happen? The smuggling of RTX that took place in 1992 in the coast of Bombay and Karnataka. That smuggling took place using exactly the same route that the gold smugglers had been using for 30 years. Because the person who's using his boat to carry RTX from Dubai or wherever to India carried gold for 20 years before that. To him, it doesn't matter what he is carrying as long as he is getting paid. To the loaders in the coast of India, who's been bringing in gold and watches and any other thing that was prohibited by law, it didn't matter what was RDX or what was something else. To the policeman who was taking a bribe to allow the gold to come in, it didn't matter whether it was gold or whether it was something else. And the whole country paid such a huge price for a law of that kind. It's not a coincidence that a law that had stayed in the books for 30 years got overturned in 1993. Because at least some lawmakers recognized that there was a problem. We have to be very careful when we design laws. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. In fact, I could raise one more. His question was, can right to property be defended without the right to bear arms? Do you know of a country that allows, or at least there are a few countries which have the right to bear arms as part of the law? The US and I'm sure the one country you would not know, but that's the country which has the largest number of per capita arms anywhere in the world. Huh? Louder, otherwise I can't hear. No, China has no per capita ownership of arms. China has no. Only the military and the police. Yeah? It's a very small country in the heart of Europe, completely landlocked. Switzerland. Switzerland is a country that has the highest per capita arms anywhere in the world. How many of you have heard of law and order problem in Switzerland? Or shooting problems in Switzerland? None. You know, because the right to bear arms doesn't matter whether it's firearms or whether it's a lathi. Does not automatically lead to violence. And Switzerland is a very good example of that. Switzerland has compulsory military service, and after the end of the service, for 2 or 3 years, every man and woman can bring back to their house some of the weapons that they used and learned. And I've been to a Swiss home where I was surprised that even Maoists in India may not have such a vast array of arms. But Switzerland is a very peaceful country. The second question that, but this needs to be discussed and debated more. So I hope some of you will think of it and discuss it further. The other question regarding this is something that struck me, and because so many of you are lawyers and aspiring lawyers, I'd like to ask. How many of you know of habeas corpus? Oh, so many, so glad. Now, habeas corpus is about the body, right? No, you have to bring the body or show the body. What is a body? Yeah, it's a human body, of course. A body to me would seem to be the first level of property. Because if we can't possess our own body, what else can we possess? And therefore, what is the link between habeas corpus and property rights? I've been asking a lot of lawyers, including my wife, and they tell me that there is no, at least in jurisprudence, there may not be a linkage. But, so this is my question to all of you. Look for a linkage. Because the system of natural rights is emanated or started from this idea of ownership of one's body. And if property can't be owned in the form of your own body or a person, what else can you own? Just think of it. Any other question? Yes, please.
In your speech, you said that presently only the poorer section of the society goes for voting. So I'll just give you an example. Recently, on 6th of March, the results were declared for the election in UP. Mulayam Singh won. So I would like to bring to your knowledge, most of you will be knowing it, that only 7% of the population of UP voted in this election.
7%?
Only 7%. Out of the whole entire population in UP, only 7% of the population in UP voted for this election, which means 93% of the population didn't even vote. The problem which I believe is, I'm sufficiently learned enough to know that neither the earlier political party which was there was uncorrupt, nor Mulayam Singh, who has just won, was uncorrupt 10 years ago. The first thing which came to my mind when I heard that Mulayam Singh won was that he wasn't in power since last 10 years. 5 years. First thing he'll be doing is that the amount he spent during these 5 years, he'll be trying to extract that back. So in this situation, where people like Mayawati or Mulayam Singh are fighting against each other, whom do you think shall I vote? That is the problem why 93% of the people do not vote.
I don't think 93% of the people did vote for that. I think, I don't know if any of you understood this. Because in UP, in the election, or in other states, 60% people voted. In Punjab it was 77%. In Tamil Nadu and Bengal it was 80%. The challenge was the population in UP or in any state is double the number of voters. Because India is a young country and therefore there are many more voters, so half the people are not eligible to vote. So in UP has a population of I think 100 plus million. 200 million and 100 million are voters. Of the 100 million, 60%, that is 60 million people went out and voted. That is a very large number. And that is a legitimate number. I'll come to the Professor is here, so I'll come back to the question of outcome of the voting later. But I just want you to remember that in every state, 50% of the population are not eligible to vote because India is a young country and therefore they are not eligible to vote. Of the 50%, when you have 60% turning out to vote, that's 60 million in case of UP, 80% turning out to vote in Tamil Nadu, 87% turning out to vote in Goa, that is what makes the system legitimate. And the section of the population which is not voting, as we saw in the Bombay municipality election, Bombay municipality election had a turnout of 40%. The middle and the rich came.